At the end of my last video, I ended with one central analogy, which painted the central quest of civilizational renewal and civilizational revival as a game that the alt-right was looking to win through the use of racial identity politics. In coming to the main portion of my video, I've decided to largely keep this analogy, discussing the movement and philosophy of the alt-right as if it were a group of chess pieces on a chessboard, and examining each of the individual problems with the alt-right by reference to the individual chess pieces, starting at the most basic level with problems in the grassroots, working up towards problems strategically and sociologically with the leadership, and ending, finally, with the difficult philosophical problems a movement based on racial populism has. I thought this would be an interesting way to keep the thoughts organized, but at any rate, the first problem with the alt-right begins at the popular level. And our analysis of the great game begins with the pawns. The problem of populism. And the problem, put succinctly, is just this. Regardless of what decisions the alt-right leadership makes in terms of its tactics, strategy, or marketing, populism and democracy will never bring a movement like this to power in a modern, first world Western country. Now, I fully realize that upon repeating this criticism, a lot of the higher up and more intellectual people in the alt-right are going to scoff. Many of them are fully aware of the problems with democracy and the problems that democracy and popular forms of action pose to their particular movements. But I think that for the ordinary viewer, especially the ordinary alt-right viewer, it's important to shut this door and demonstrate the myriad reasons why this door has to be shut before we can go forward and critique the larger and more abstract problems that the alt-right has, and why it won't be able to accomplish its vision. Because especially after the election of Donald Trump and in the UK Brexit, a lot of people on the dissident right and even the alt-right seem to believe that a popular groundswell might indeed be their salvation. A lot of people might not believe that the alt-right has to have some kind of coherent philosophy or an ability to develop reliable leadership, because they're under the impression that populism, the election victories, will inevitably restore the West to its rightful place. The borders will shut, the immigrants will go back to their country of origin, and no further radical action really needs to be entertained, least of all the development of some kind of dynamic leader that would have to row hard against cultural changes in the West and unseat the reigning philosophy of consumeristic individualism. From this vantage point, someone anticipating a popular victory or a democratic victory could imagine that the question of nihilism and lack of meaning and purpose in society might be a question for later generations. Close the border, restore ethnic homogeny, and we'll sort the rest of the hard philosophical questions out later. But unfortunately, nothing is going to be that easy, because there is no democratic or populist victory available to a movement like the alt-right in any form that they would recognize. And every now and again you meet an alt-righter who is just gobsmacked that Trump is not executing on a lot of the promises he made to his constituencies, especially a lot of the promises he made along the lines of ensuring that nationalist and ethno-nationalist priorities would come before the priorities of globalization. And people talked about this like it's a spot of bad luck or even a betrayal, that Trump was just the wrong choice and maybe another leader would have done differently. But really, this has nothing to do with luck. This has to do with culture, with political incentives, and how the alt-right and how nationalist movements generally are organized in the modern world. Politicians are not mindless robots that behave at the behest of the desires of their constituents. Politicians react to incentives, and those incentives come in the form of pressure, either political pressure from below in the long term, or pressure from above in the form of culture and cultural elites. The alt-right at this stage is still, for everything, a movement of the dispossessed, a movement of unemployed men, a movement of childless women, a movement of dispossessed factory workers, and the lost working class. These are groups with no window into high culture, or the media that reproduces culture, and the institutions that represent them have almost no influence among elite decision makers. These people have no power in the corporate world, in the academic world, and even in the many appointed offices in government. All that remains for a right-wing populist movement such as this is to put a single leader atop an apparatus that is totally culturally opposed to the objectives that given leader was elected to fulfill. It doesn't take a psychologist, a sociologist, or a political scientist to realize that in that situation, the given elected leader is going to realize who holds the real reins of power and make his decisions accordingly. And for all the alt-right's understanding of how culture jamming and memes can be used to short-circuit taboos at a cultural level, they seem to have made the fundamental cultural mistake that the previous conservative movement before them made, namely, believing that political swings at an electoral level can be an effective proxy by which to push back long-term cultural and demographic changes. Now, I think a lot of alt-righters will agree with me when I point out that these cultural changes and demographic changes brought by immigration were facilitated and accomplished only because a large majority of cultural elites saw these changes as good. But there seems to be some kind of resistance to realizing the rather obvious corollary, that these cultural trends will only be pushed back once America has a different cultural elite that thinks that they should be pushed back. Now, I'm sure a lot of people on the alt-right might agree with this proposition, but I'm left speculating how they believe a popular movement is going to accomplish a change in the cultural attitudes of elites. I mean, one hypothetical way it could occur is that cultural trends popular among the dispossessed middle class and aging working class will somehow filter up into elite minds. But of course, this is contrary to how we've seen most cultural trends form. In the operation of normal society, most of the time, ideas, opinions, and cultural trends filter from the upper and elite classes down to the lower and working classes. Seeing a reverse trend would be very rare, and moreover, hoping for one would be utterly futile. But of course, there is potentially another option. If you can't convince the current cultural elites, perhaps, through some ingenious political manipulation, the people of this burgeoning populist movement might come to replace them, working their way up slowly but surely. I mean, things like this have happened historically in certain circumstances. It's rare. Every now and again, you get some kind of burgeoning middle class, some enthusiastic, up-and-coming ethnic group that by its own gumption works its way into a leadership position in a leadership system that was formerly opposed to it. But to answer this possibility, I think we need to do nothing more than just look at the modern alt-right and ask ourselves if this is possible with the people they have in their populist movement. Now, I know other alt-right figures have pointed this out, but the white working class that brought Donald J. Trump into the White House is not the white working class of the 1950s. It is a deeply, deeply troubled demographic. It has experienced the worst aspects of modernity over the last 40 years. Gone are the two-parent families, the 8 hours of hard union labor followed by service at the community center. Gone are the days of grange halls and family farms, of the middle American factory worker with the white picket fence. Modern white America has caught some of the worst aspects of modernity. Drug culture is prevalent. Church attendance is dropping. Illegitimacy rates are rising, almost to the point where we could say that any connection to the previous American culture of the 1950s and earlier eras is almost entirely sentimental. These are not people ready to move into semi-professional and professional roles in some kind of new dispensation. They can barely hold their own ground where they stand. And much could be said for the same modern unemployed NEET, the guy living in his parents' basement, listening to Melania Woes and Richard Spencer. These people aren't ready for any upward mobility, and they certainly aren't ready to push back against the nihilism of modernity. In fact, they're victims of it. Sure, they'll retreat Donald Trump and Pepe memes, but don't expect them to get involved in municipal politics. And so, for all its ability in the meme wars, the alt-right in its present populist form remains singularly unable to influence elite culture. And without elite culture, politicians placed in office through momentary populist swells will feel absolutely no pressure to carry out counter-progressive policies. Now here I must address one last potential criticism. What about continued populist efforts? Not simply a swell, but a group of people who return to the polls again and again and again in order to hold any number of politicians' feet to the fire. Certainly, over a long enough time frame, this would have effects. And in the abstract, there is some truth to it. Over a long enough time frame, a populist movement might have some effect on politicians. But here is the central problem. The alt-right, and indeed all nationalist populism in the West, cannot make a long-term, credible political threat. The demographics simply will not allow it. I certainly don't need to explain to the movement that invented the hashtag white genocide that in almost all Western countries, the native population is a quickly dwindling percentage of the total population of those countries. Moreover, now that the era of mass migration has moved the analysis of political demographics from a national scale to an international scale, the proportion of the world's population that is white is decreasing almost at an exponential rate. And since the world population can easily be brought to any particular country as new voters, the overall effect is not hard to see. And in many ways, the long-term career of politicians depends on analyzing the value of demographics and having certain demographic groups on their side. Thus, a prudent democratic politician might ask himself whether it's a good idea or a wise idea to be more popular among Africans than among Europeans. Sort of in a similar way that a stockbroker might wonder whether it's smarter to buy Apple or Google. Now, I'm sure people have seen demographic projections of the total population of Africa versus the total population of Europe. It's scary, but looking from the perspective of an international politician, at this graph, would you want to own stock in the European demographic or the African one? Again, the politicians would have to be stupid to not know where their interests were ultimately. Populist nationalist movements without highly trained elite vanguards will always fail, and this problem is only compounded by the existence of these stark demographic trends worldwide. Current attempts to push back against politicians promoting large-scale immigration into Europe have failed, which means that Europe is likely to be in the same position that America is, namely, with a white population that is very quickly dwindling to a smaller percentage of the population. Therefore, as these populist nationalist movements increase their percentage of whites, they will nonetheless continue to decrease in overall power. And here, I'm tempted to quote Larry the Liquidator from one of my favorite movies, Other People's Money, on how you go bankrupt.
We're dead, all right. We're just not broke. And you know the surest way to go broke? Keep getting an increasing share of a shrinking market. Down the tubes, slow but sure.
And indeed, just like that, populism is doomed. And this creates the last problem. As nationalist populist movements continue to spring up and fail, in their ambitions to take power at a national level, a new class of cynical and paranoid ex-nationalists will emerge in the wake of these failures, along with being increasingly vulnerable to slipping further into the vices of modernity, such as pornography, video games, and drugs. These cynical individuals will be incredibly easy to manipulate, and will be looking for any radical mechanism to strike back at the society they felt betrayed them. A recipe not for a constructive nationalist movement, but only chaos and disorder. The larger political objectives of the alt-right can only be accomplished once some effort has been put not only into solving the manifest dysfunction of the middle and working classes, but also towards influencing and creating new narratives inside the elite, academic, and corporate classes. The nihilism of both of these groups must be confronted, and it can only be confronted by some type of elite intellectual vanguard, some set of leaders willing to be responsible and take charge. But as I will review in later sections, the creation of such a vanguard has its own set of problems for the alt-right.